On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury in Chicago returned an indictment that would bring the most powerful crime lord in American history to his knees, and it had nothing to do with murder, bootlegging, or racketeering. The man named in that indictment was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, a 32-year-old gangster who controlled an empire estimated to generate over $100 million a year during the height of Prohibition. So how did a man who ordered assassinations from the back seat of an armored Cadillac, who owned police precincts and city aldermen, who survived multiple attempts on his life and outwitted rival gangs for nearly a decade, ultimately fall to a charge as mundane as failing to pay his income taxes? To understand the answer, you have to travel back to the streets of Brooklyn at the turn of the 20th century, to a tenement at 95 Navy Street, where Gabriele and Teresina Capone, immigrants from a small town near Naples, raised 9 children in a cramped apartment that smelled of garlic and drying laundry. Young Alphonse was not born into crime. His father was a barber. His mother took in sewing. He attended school through the 6th grade, and by most accounts he was reasonably bright. But the Five Points neighborhood exerted a gravitational pull on boys like him. He fell in with the South Brooklyn Rippers and then the 40 Thieves Juniors, 2 juvenile street gangs that served as feeders for the adult criminal organizations that ran the waterfront. By his late teens, Capone had come to the attention of Johnny Torrio, a Brooklyn-born racketeer with an eye for talent and a taste for organization over brute force. Torrio would soon relocate to Chicago to manage operations for his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, and when Torrio needed muscle in 1919, he sent for Capone. That summons changed the trajectory of American organized crime. Chicago in 1920 was a city on the edge of a massive, government-created opportunity. The 18th Amendment took effect on January 17th, and overnight the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the entire United States. The law did not reduce demand. It obliterated legal supply, and into that vacuum rushed men willing to break the law on an industrial scale. Big Jim Colosimo, however, was cautious. He was making enough money from brothels and gambling. Torrio saw the fortune waiting in bootlegging and grew frustrated. On May 11, 1920, Colosimo was shot dead in the vestibule of his own restaurant. The murder was never officially solved, but historians widely believe Torrio orchestrated it, possibly with the young Capone's direct involvement. With Colosimo gone, Torrio took control, and Capone became his right hand. What happened over the next 5 years was a masterclass in criminal capitalism. Torrio and Capone built a vertically integrated alcohol empire. They didn't simply hijack beer trucks. They owned breweries, distilleries, and distribution networks that stretched from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. They bribed police captains, judges, and politicians with the same efficiency a legitimate corporation might lobby a congressman. By 1925, Torrio had survived an assassination attempt by the rival North Side gang and decided he had had enough. He handed the entire operation to Capone and left for Italy. Capone was 26 years old, and he was now the undisputed boss of the Chicago outfit. If you're watching this and you find yourself drawn to these untold mechanics of organized crime, the deals behind the deals, the systems behind the violence, then consider subscribing. This channel exists for people who want to understand how these shadow empires actually worked, not just the Hollywood version, but the documented reality. Now, here's where the tax story truly begins, and it starts with a paradox that Capone either did not see or chose to ignore. The more visible he became, the more vulnerable he was. By the mid-1920s, Capone was not hiding in the shadows, he was holding press conferences. He attended baseball games and opera performances. He tipped waiters with $100 bills. He wore custom suits and diamond-studded belt buckles. He owned a 14-room retreat on Palm Island in Miami Beach, Florida. Purchased in 1928 for $40,000, he traveled with a retinue of bodyguards. Reporters followed him like he was a movie star. And all of this raised a very simple question that no journalist thought to ask, but that a small group of federal agents was quietly investigating. Where, on paper, did Alphonse Capone's money come from? The answer, as far as the Internal Revenue Service was concerned, was nowhere. Capone had never filed a single federal income tax return, not one. He had no bank accounts in his own name. He owned no property in his own name. He had no declared source of income whatsoever. To the tax authorities, he was a ghost, and yet here he was, living like a king in plain sight. That contradiction became the crack through which the federal government would eventually drive a wedge that toppled him. The strategy did not emerge from nowhere. It had a precedent, and that precedent is a detail most people overlook. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called United States v. Sullivan, which established a principle that now seems obvious, but at the time was genuinely contested. Income derived from illegal activity was still subject to federal income tax. The court ruled that the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination did not excuse a citizen from filing a tax return. You could decline to specify the nature of the income, but you could not simply refuse to report it. This ruling was the legal foundation upon which the entire Capone prosecution would be built. Without Sullivan, the government's case would have had no legs. The man who understood this best was Elmer Lincoln Eyre, the chief of the IRS intelligence unit. Eyre was not a flashy man. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in a measured, almost bureaucratic tone, but he was relentless. In 1929, he assigned a team of agents to the Capone case, led by a special agent named Frank J. Wilson. Wilson was the opposite of Capone in every conceivable way. He was quiet, meticulous, and obsessive about paperwork. He worked 16-hour days, hunched over ledgers in a smoke-filled office, tracing every dollar he could find. His task was monumental: prove that Capone had received specific identifiable income and had willfully failed to pay taxes on it. This required not just finding money, but connecting it directly to Capone in a way that could survive cross-examination in a courtroom. Here is where the investigation gets genuinely fascinating, because Capone had built a system specifically designed to prevent exactly what Wilson was trying to do. The outfit operated almost entirely in cash. Payments were made hand-to-hand. There were no checks, no invoices, no receipts. Capone himself never signed anything. He used intermediaries for every transaction. His brother Ralph handled much of the financial management. His accountant, Jake Guzik, managed the books. If books existed at all, they were kept in code or destroyed after use. Wilson later described the early months of his investigation as staring at a brick wall. There seemed to be no way in, but then Wilson caught a break, and it came from the most mundane place imaginable: a dusty storage closet. In 1930, while searching through records seized during a raid on a gambling establishment called the Hawthorne Smoke Shop in Cicero, Illinois, Wilson found a set of ledgers. These were not ordinary notebooks. They contained detailed records of income and expenditures from the gambling operation, and critically, they included notations in handwriting that could be linked to specific individuals in Capone's organization. The amounts were staggering. One ledger showed profits of over $500,000 in a single 18-month period from just one establishment. Wilson realized that if he could connect these profits to Capone's direct control, he could demonstrate unreported income. But handwriting alone wouldn't be enough. Wilson needed someone on the inside, someone who could testify to Capone's actual role in managing the money. This is where the investigation turned dangerous. Capone had a long history of eliminating witnesses. In the years leading up to the tax case, at least 3 potential informants were murdered, under circumstances that strongly suggested outfit involvement. Wilson himself later revealed that his life was threatened multiple times during the investigation. He varied his routes to work. He slept with a revolver. His wife lived in constant fear. The pressure was immense, and the government could not afford to lose another witness. Meanwhile, there was another team working a parallel track, and their story is worth a brief detour because it illuminates just how many resources the federal government was throwing at Capone. This was the team led by Elliot Ness, a 27-year-old prohibition agent who assembled a squad of 9 men specifically chosen for their incorruptibility. They became known as the Untouchables. Ness and his team conducted raids on Capone's breweries and distilleries, seizing equipment and product worth millions. Their work generated headlines and put public pressure on Capone, but here is the irony that most people miss. The Untouchables' raids did not directly contribute to the tax case. Ness was enforcing prohibition laws, not tax laws. The 2 investigations ran in parallel, coordinated loosely at best. It was Wilson's painstaking ledger work, not Ness's dramatic raids, that ultimately put Capone in prison. The popular narrative has the proportions reversed. By early 1931, Wilson had assembled enough evidence to present to a grand jury. He had identified specific income streams totaling at least $1 million over a 6-year period that Capone had never reported. He had witnesses willing to testify about Capone's control of gambling operations and his receipt of cash payments. He had the ledgers. He had bank records from accounts held by Capone's associates that showed patterns of deposits consistent with profit-sharing arrangements. And he had testimony from cashiers, clerks, and minor functionaries who had been squeezed by the IRS into cooperating. On June 5, 1931, the grand jury returned a 23-count indictment charging Capone with income tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. The total amount of unpaid taxes was calculated at $215,080.48, with additional penalties and interest. To put that in perspective, adjusted for inflation, that is roughly equivalent to $4 million today. Capone's annual income during those years was estimated by prosecutors at over $100 million. The taxes he owed were a fraction of what he earned. He could have paid them from the change in his pocket, but he hadn't, and now that failure was the only charge the government needed. Capone's initial response was confident, almost dismissive. He had beaten every charge thrown at him before. Murder charges had evaporated. Prohibition violations had been thrown out. He had the best lawyers money could buy. His lead attorney was a former Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Capone believed he could fix this case the same way he had fixed everything else, through bribery and intimidation, and initially it looked like he might succeed. In the weeks before trial, Capone's legal team negotiated a plea deal with the prosecution. Capone would plead guilty to certain charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 2 to 5 years. It seemed like a manageable outcome. Capone agreed. But then something remarkable happened. Federal Judge James H. Wilkerson, who had been assigned to the case, refused to accept the plea agreement. On the day the plea was to be entered, Wilkerson announced from the bench that he was not bound by any agreement between the prosecution and the defense, and that he would impose whatever sentence he deemed appropriate based on the evidence. Capone's lawyers were stunned. The plea deal collapsed. The case would go to trial. What followed was one of the most dramatic courtroom episodes in American legal history, and Wilkerson's next move was arguably even more extraordinary than rejecting the plea. Concerned that Capone's organization had tampered with the jury pool, Wilkerson waited until the morning of October 6, 1931, the first day of trial, and then switched his entire jury panel with that of another judge's courtroom. The prospective jurors who had been vetted and potentially bribed by Capone's people were gone. In their place sat a panel of men from rural communities outside Chicago, men with no connection to the outfit and no reason to fear it. Capone, sitting at the defense table in a mustard yellow suit, reportedly turned pale. The trial lasted 11 days. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses. They introduced the Hawthorne smoke shop ledgers. They presented testimony from Capone's own financial associates, including a bookkeeper named Leslie Shumway, whom Wilson had tracked down to a horse racing track in Florida after months of searching. Shumway's testimony was devastating. He confirmed that the ledger entries represented real income, that the income was under Capone's control, and that none of it had been reported to the IRS. The defense attempted to argue that Capone had suffered gambling losses that offset his income, but the prosecution systematically dismantled this claim by showing that Capone's lifestyle, his homes, his cars, his wardrobe, his entourage, was fundamentally inconsistent with a man who was merely breaking even. On October 17, 1931, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on 5 counts of income tax evasion and failure to file tax returns. On October 24th, Judge Wilkerson handed down the sentence: 11 years in federal prison, plus $50,000 in fines and $30,000 in court costs. It was the harshest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. Capone was visibly shaken. He had expected, at worst, a short stint in a minimum security facility. Instead, he was going away for more than a decade. He began his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. But in August 1934, he was transferred to the newly opened federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was designed specifically for inmates like Capone, high-profile prisoners who had demonstrated an ability to corrupt the system from the inside. On Alcatraz, Capone was prisoner number 85. He was given no special privileges. He worked in the laundry. He ate in the general mess hall. He was cut off from his organization, his lawyers, and his money. The man who had once controlled Chicago was now controlled by a daily routine, dictated by guards in a concrete cell block surrounded by frigid water. But prison was not the worst thing that happened to Al Capone. The worst thing had been happening for years, silently inside his own body. Capone had contracted syphilis as a young man, likely during his days in Brooklyn, and he had never sought treatment. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz, the disease had progressed to its tertiary stage, attacking his central nervous system. Over the course of his imprisonment, his mental faculties deteriorated steadily. He became confused, disoriented, and occasionally violent. By 1938, prison doctors assessed that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. He was transferred to a facility in Terminal Island, California, and then released on November 16, 1939, having served 7 years and 6 months, with time off for good behavior. He was 40 years old, but he was a broken man. Capone spent his remaining years at his Palm Island estate in Florida, under the care of his wife, May. He wandered the grounds, sometimes fishing in the swimming pool with a rod and reel, convinced he was catching something. He had paranoid episodes. He talked to people who weren't there. Visitors who had known him in his prime were shocked by what they found. On January 25, 1947, he died of cardiac arrest following a stroke, complicated by pneumonia. He was 48 years old. The most feared gangster of the 20th century did not die in a hail of bullets or in an electric chair. He died in his pajamas, his mind gone, surrounded by family members he could no longer recognize. The ripple effects of Capone's tax conviction were enormous and lasting. The case established a template that federal law enforcement would use for decades to come. If you cannot prove the headline crime, follow the money. The IRS Intelligence Unit, later renamed Criminal Investigation, became one of the most feared agencies in the federal government, and its techniques were refined and expanded over the following years. The Capone case directly inspired the investigation and conviction of dozens of other organized crime figures. Waxy Gordon, a major Prohibition-era bootlegger, was convicted of tax evasion in 1933, using methods pioneered in the Capone case. Frank Nitti, Capone's own successor as head of the Chicago outfit, was indicted for tax evasion in 1943 and chose to shoot himself rather than face trial. The pattern repeated itself across the country. If the mob could not be brought down through RICO statutes or murder charges, the taxmen would come instead. Consider this statistic for a moment. Between 1930 and 1960, the IRS Intelligence Unit secured convictions against more than 100 major organized crime figures, and the vast majority of those cases used investigative frameworks that traced directly back to the work Frank Wilson did on the Capone file. Wilson himself went on to become the head of the Secret Service, and he spent the rest of his career advocating for the use of financial investigation as a primary law enforcement tool. The idea that you could dismantle a criminal empire, not through wiretaps or informants, but through ledgers and bank statements, was revolutionary at the time. It is now standard practice. There is one more layer to this story that deserves attention, because it speaks to something larger than one man's downfall. Capone's refusal to pay taxes was not simply an oversight. It was an expression of a fundamental belief shared by many organized crime figures of his era, that the rules did not apply to them. Capone operated in a world where the law was something to be bought, circumvented, or ignored. He bribed mayors and senators. He controlled police departments. He dictated who lived and who died on the streets of Chicago. In that context, paying income tax must have seemed absurd, a concession to a system he had already conquered. But the system had one feature Capone failed to account for. It was vast, it was bureaucratic, and it was patient. A bribed cop could look the other way. A bribed judge could dismiss a case, but the Internal Revenue Service had thousands of agents, standardized procedures, and an institutional memory that did not forget. You could corrupt individuals within the system. You could not corrupt the system itself. The irony that sits at the center of this entire saga is almost too perfect. Al Capone, who was responsible for or directly ordered an estimated 200 murders, who orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, who ran a criminal empire that touched every corner of American vice, was brought down by the most boring charge in the federal criminal code. Not racketeering, not conspiracy, not murder. Failure to file a tax return. The United States government, unable to prove what everyone in Chicago already knew, found the one thread it could pull and pulled it until the entire tapestry unraveled. And perhaps that is the most important lesson embedded in this story. Empires, whether legitimate or criminal, do not usually collapse because of a single catastrophic event. They collapse because someone somewhere ignored a small obligation, a routine filing, a mundane requirement, and that small failure compounded over time until it became the only vulnerability that mattered. Capone could have paid his taxes. He could have declared even a portion of his income, attributed it to gambling winnings or real estate, and the government would have had one less avenue of attack. He did not because he believed he was untouchable. He was wrong, and that gap between self-perception and reality, between the image of invincibility and the fragile truth beneath it, is a gap that has swallowed kings, presidents, and crime lords throughout history. It will swallow them again.